website, and no one ever sends you a get command, the content of that website will never ever get into the pipes of these broadband internet access providers. So why do I care about this? Well, I care because the broadband internet access providers are already being paid by their customers to be able to send that get command and then to actually receive the content. It's not Google or whomever else putting content into their pipes. It's their customer asking for it. Okay, that's point one. That's one fundamental characteristic about the internet that you need to know for this conversation. The other is broadband internet access service is not competitive. There isn't meaningful choice for consumers to choose among the service providers that can get that information provided that they pay them. Statistics, lies, damn lies, and statistics. I think one of the statistics is that the average American has fewer than one choice of broadband internet access providers of over 10 megabits per second, which is fairly high speed, but it's almost de rigueur these days for the content that's out there. So it's not as if you have a variety of choices in your home where you can say, oh, if that guy is doing untoward things to the content, if that guy is filtering out what I'm able to access, I'm going to go to this one, this one, this one, or this one. You don't have the choice. And moreover, the switching costs where you are fortunate enough to have, I live in suburban DC here, and I do actually have a choice of two. The switching costs are incredibly high. And in my case, the major switching cost is digging up my wife's flowers in the front yard when they have to put a new wire in. I'm not going to change because I get in trouble. So the point is, first of all, it's a pull technology. The stuff doesn't get in the pipes unless the consumer asks for it. And second, the consumer has, at best, two choices and usually actually less than one. Thanks.
Quick follow-up, Paul. Net neutrality, I mentioned the fast lane, slow lane. Is that a issue that Amazon has formally weighed in on in terms of whether or not they think that there should be faster lanes for more pay, slower lanes for less pay? Or is that one that they're still working on?
We have formally weighed in opposition to allowing network broadband internet access service providers to create those fast and slow lanes. Again, because consumers have nowhere else to go. If they're allowed to do this, we can't just boot them out. If Verizon does it, consumer just doesn't have a choice to go somewhere else or at least a meaningful ability to go elsewhere.
Okay. Now let me make the devil's advocate argument, even though in my litigation practice I never represented the devil. I do have my standards. But devil's advocate argument, then we've got, and not necessarily devil's advocate argument to your position, but maybe in corroboration of what you said, we've got in our membership at NRB both very large ministries and broadcasters who webcast and have web streaming facilities. And then we have small mom and pop ministries. Now the mom and pop ministries are not going to be able to afford those fast lanes. And obviously the big companies will. So I suppose that would be an argument in favor of, look, let's just have all the lanes for everybody at the same price, and that would be an argument in favor of what you've indicated. So I guess the harm, and I'm going to ask a question of you, Andrew, next, but the harm we're envisioning is such a disparity, in other words, the creation of a disparity between the haves and have-nots in terms of speed, and speed on the internet has become everything. We all know that. We will not use a device that's too slow when we can buy a device for even slightly more that'll give us faster accessibility and connectivity. So is that primarily the harm that you're envisioning from Amazon's position? If we don't have net neutrality regulations in place, we'll have haves and have-nots, winners and losers on the internet?
I think that's the secondary problem. The primary problem is that you're actually reducing the amount of choice that end consumers who are paying for access get.
Okay.
And so they are paying for that access. If they want to go and view the small ministries' TV program rather than the big ones, they ought to be able to get to that because they've paid for that. They've paid for the ability to get that video.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
so
they paid the toll, therefore I should be able to get to every exit ramp that I want to.
Yep.
Okay. All right, then Andrew, let me switch to you. Now, Andrew, you're part of this intellectual foundry known as Heritage. And Heritage has a long heritage of very articulate and well thought out defense of and belief in the free market system. Now, a lot of the advocates, or a lot of the opponents of net neutrality, and by the way, net neutrality requires an agency like the FCC to regulate and enforce it. So what's the upside or the downside from the standpoint of free market if the FCC or any agency, the Federal Trade Commission or whoever, decides to say, no, we will put in place rules that make it either difficult or impossible for internet providers to sell fast lane to well-heeled companies and then deny it to the small operations that can't pay the fee?
Sure. I guess I would just say, to begin with, if our concern is with consumer choice, in the realm of internet service provision, we're not just dealing with a person buying a web page and then being able to see it. For example, when you purchase online subscriptions to newspapers, depending on whether you're using a mobile device or you're logging in from India or whether you're logging in from a governmental computer or a personal computer, you'll get vastly different prices. So let me give you one example. I subscribe to the Financial Times, and it'll be 2 or 3 times the cost to purchase a full subscription online if I'm logging in from a certain IP address versus another. So what does that tell you? It tells you when you're getting a web page, you're not just buying one product, you're buying one of a number of products. And I think in the case of fast lane, slow lane, the customer should get what they pay for, but some customers may prefer to pay more money to receive Amazon streaming video at a faster speed, and other customers may choose to pay less to receive it at a slower speed. So the free market tells you, I think, that there are choices out there. It's not a binary choice between provision of service and no provision of service. And I guess the first thing I would do would be to take umbrage with the fact that, or with the argument that consumers really have no choice here. Second of all, I guess what we're arguing potentially about here, we need to ask ourselves, what is the problem here? Is the problem First Amendment values? Is it that we have this long list of conservative or religious organizations that are being censored by private companies? Is it a kind of free speech problem? Is it a monopolistic problem? Is it a breach of contract problem? Are we concerned that Facebook's terms of service is somehow not upfront, or that they're not living by their own terms of service? And until we answer the question what potentially the problem is here, we won't necessarily know what the solution is. So I guess I'm a guy who likes to learn from history, and so I would just point, given the company we're in right now, I would just point to another time where numerous organizations were very, very concerned about a monopoly on viewpoints and called for FCC regulation. And let me just quote an FCC order from 1987. The FCC said that regulation in this area places the government in the intrusive role of scrutinizing program content, creates the opportunity for abuse for partisan political purposes, and imposes unnecessary costs upon both broadcasters and the commission. That was in the fairness doctrine context. So I would just be very concerned with potentially handing the reins of economic regulation over to for lack of a better term, pointy-headed bureaucrats that may have a political agenda. You start off by saying that there's a problem with choice and with provision of services, and you end up with Washington dictating when and how you'll receive different internet products.
Jeffrey, let me go to you next, but let me set this up a little bit, because I want to go back to something that Paul had said, fascinating about the push-pull, and I have heard that before. In terms of what the real dynamics, the engineering dynamics are of content on the internet. We were over at the Library of Congress this morning, and we all got a chance to see the Gutenberg Bible. Now, last time I was at the Library of Congress a couple years ago, I got a book from their bookstore about the history of the Gutenberg Bible and the printing press that was used to create it. Now, we all know the revolution that took place in the 1450s. With the development of movable type on a printing press. It revolutionized information, communication, religion, culture, society, you name it. But the difference was that in the intervening couple hundred years, printing presses were fairly feasible to be constructed by a blacksmith or a carpenter or a basic homemade engineer in his basement. And the proliferation of printing presses became a problem with tyrannical governments who didn't want them to print things that were critical to government. But there were a multiplicity of these printing press platforms. I would suggest in the 21st century we have a new printing press, but it is not a multiplicity, it is a single printing press called the internet with a multiplicity of levers. Now if you look at it from that standpoint, and I'm going to go to follow up to what Paul had said, in terms of how free speech factors into this, how we should view free speech. Some of the edge providers, Apple, let me use Facebook, that's probably the best illustration, or Twitter. And by the way, when we did our study, Twitter came out with the only passing grade, in our opinion, of not perpetrating viewpoint censorship. There was one or two examples that kind of bordered on it, on the possibility of viewpoint shutdown, but other than that, their standards basically say, look, if it's outrageous, it's going to go out there, and that's what we're all about. The rest of them didn't get passing grades from us, particularly Facebook. But Facebook specializes in and has made its billions on user-generated content. If we, the users, did not post our Facebook pages, they would have no utility to their utility. And this goes to the case that I think I cited to you before our dialogue, and I mentioned that we might talk about it. Clayman versus Zuckerberg. It was a DC Circuit Court of Appeals case in 2014. The details aren't important, except that that was Judicial Watch that filed a lawsuit against Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, saying if you would have taken down these pro-jihadist postings on Facebook, there may not have been a loss of life over in the Middle East. The court threw it out, not surprisingly, because Congress, in their wisdom, has given immunity in a specific statute to conduits of information on the internet. Now, does it make sense to make a distinction between mere conduits, like Facebook, that are simply a pipeline, sophisticated pipeline very much, but a pipeline for our comments, and let's say Amazon, who is a retail seller who pushes out to the public a variety of services and products? Is it intelligent to make that distinction in terms of one should have a higher degree of free speech responsibility than the other?
So, what is Facebook? Is it like a printing press? Is it like the Gutenberg Bible? I love Dr. Johnson's citation of Henry Adams in his introductory remarks. Henry Adams was my hero, and I wrote about it in college, and that idea that Adams felt like he had more in common with Moses than with the 20th century is what I feel like as I try to imagine the metaphor. Is Facebook like the printers of the Gutenberg Bible, or is it something else? Now, you mentioned a very important provision of American law, and that's Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And that sounds technical, but it's actually the core to much of what makes the internet in the US free. And Section 230 says that if the internet companies do not actively review content on their own, but merely allow users to post content, then they are not liable for illegal content that's posted on their platforms. 230, on the one hand, has led to an astonishing cornucopia of free speech, the very fulfillment of Oliver Wendell Holmes' notion of the marketplace of ideas, because it's allowed Facebook generally and Google to put up stuff that can be very offensive, as the Innocence of the Muslims video showed, but also can be central to public debate. But also, as we saw just last week, it can lead to terrible controversies. So there's a new one of these things every day. And the one last week was these very offensive and troubling nude pictures that celebrities had posted. Jennifer Lawrence had taken pictures of herself, and they circulated on the internet, and they were clearly illegal because her account had been hacked into. It was a terrible phishing scandal, and someone got her email address, and she was trying to get Facebook and Google to remove them, and their initial response was, no, we won't, because we didn't choose to post them, and this has been widely shared on places like Reddit and so forth, and we would lose our immunity under American law if we put ourselves in the position of deciding what was in good taste and what wasn't. Then we would be like the printers of the Gutenberg Bible, and we can't possibly play that role and also be a free speech platform. Now, in response to pushback, there were calls for amending Section 230 to create an exemption for libelous material or material that was highly offensive to a reasonable person. The companies made different decisions, and some of them took some of the videos down, although in practice, as we know, once the video has gone viral, it's very hard to remove it even if a company wants to. But my broad response is no, I don't think that Facebook and Google and Twitter should be treated like printing presses. They just do not have the bandwidth to actually make the kind of editorial decisions that a printing press would require, as this right to be forgotten right shows. So now, just let's put on the table what this new proposed right of the European Commission forces Google and Facebook and Twitter to do. It says that any data subject, that's any of you, has the right to demand the deletion of any content regarding you, and Google and Facebook presumptively have to remove it, or else face a loss of up to 2% of their annual income, which in Google's case was $50 billion last year per incident, unless some privacy commissioner in Dublin or India later decides that the content is in the public interest. So they're understandably distressed by this because they have no staff to review every single content request. Many of these requests are coming from European politicians who made the mistake of, I don't know, posing for racy pictures of themselves in the past, as Italian politicians tend to do, and then run for public office, and then they're shocked, and want the pictures removed. And Google initially says, no, this is necessary for public discourse, but if they guess wrong, you know, that's millions of dollars per incident. It tends to focus the mind. My instinct is that the American solution, which is not present in Europe, to immunize the service providers is the right instinct. And the objection of NRB, which I share, I think all of the examples that are on this pamphlet are troubling, are best addressed not by regulating the Facebook providers like publishers. I think it has to do with political and constitutional pressure to make Google and Facebook more like Twitter. So Twitter's just decided voluntarily to be more libertarian, and Google and Facebook could be, and they need to be persuaded.
All right, and now that's a great point, and it segues to something I want to ask you, Paul, because I want to shift to solutions. The fast lane, slow lane issue and net neutrality is going to be decided by the FCC. My guess is they're going to do some variation of it. They have, you know, three times is a charm, I guess. And the third time they'll try it, but they've been shot down by the Court of Appeals a couple times. But they will do it. They will take in consideration our comments, but they'll have some network management criteria they use to say when broadband providers can and when they can't cut special deals for pay for priority and when they can't. So they will regulate this to some degree. Meanwhile, on the free speech aspect, this Pastor Daniel Usbun of First Baptist Church in Moreland, Georgia, who gets his YouTube sermon taken down because he's critical of ISIS and apparently spoke too vehemently about Islam, that was a decision made by Google-owned YouTube, according to their interpretation of their hate speech standards. Now, we all agree the First Amendment doesn't constrain YouTube from making that decision. My proposal is that's true, but all of those companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, and I would put Amazon in the same category, although not to the same extent, have made their profits and have advanced their innovation on the idea of openness of information and accessibility of the public to that information. What would the harm be, and I see great benefit, if of edge providers of all kinds were to subscribe to a voluntary standard? You know, I notice the FCC from time to time will not hold a telecom company liable, or they won't enforce a certain rule if they get a pledge of voluntary compliance from an otherwise regulated entity. So, what would be the downside of these companies agreeing to voluntarily comply with a First Amendment type view rather than the policies they have now, which a wide variety of pundits, you know, libertarians and conservatives and others, have criticized these hate speech standards because they're so arbitrary and they can be used to suppress ideas they simply don't like. What would be wrong with just using the First Amendment as the paradigm and voluntarily adopting that as much as compatible with the business realities of that platform? What would the greatest downside, if there is one, be to that kind of approach?
Well, obviously there would be a lot of importance associated with the details of any such voluntary standard, but the fact of a standard removes a degree of choice and free market action If every company agrees to do everything identically, then every company is identical. And so I think the way we handle and act on behalf of our customers is something that we do for them. And we don't want to be constrained to do what everybody else is doing. We want to be able to innovate on their behalf in all cases. And so in the case of net neutrality, what we're trying to say is that would be fine as well for Verizon and Comcast if they actually faced any competition. We do, they don't. And so we would like to be able to continue to serve our customers by increasing selection. I think we have something like, I don't know, there's well over 50 million unique items that we sell these days, and a lot of them are written materials. And that's been our tradition from the beginning. Always trying to provide our customers more selection is the way we've built our business. What's the harm in a voluntary standard? I don't know. I think, frankly, what you're doing here, Craig, is pretty important because this kind of information just isn't readily available to consumers. When they're making a choice about which service to use, this kind of thing, this ought to inform them, right? And they could say,
So you're going to consumer choice?
yeah, well,
okay.
absolutely. But it's informed consumers that matter.
Yeah. Let me, we're getting to the point where we're going to open this up for Q&A from the audience, but I'd like to give you each a minute or two of some closing comments about either something we've talked about or something we haven't addressed that you think is of real interest to you in terms of the dynamics of encouraging further innovation, respecting free market competition, but also providing opportunities to expand on citizen free speech values on these platforms. So Andrew, let me start with you if I can.
I guess one thing that I would like to say that I should have mentioned earlier is to take a little bit of issue with the idea that the internet is some sort of printing press, not because I don't agree with it in theory, but because it's not one printing press, it's multiple printing presses, if it is anything. So why do cable providers, why does Comcast lay down cable? Because they have an incentive to sell their services to edge providers and folks like that. And I guess one of my major concerns is the major growth of the internet, the major growth of the ability to get your 10 megabyte per second bandwidth. That all comes from, in part, the profit motive here. And so I would just strongly caution folks that when you're talking net neutrality, you're, to some degree, talking about getting rid of the very reasons why we have this infrastructure in place in the first place. The second point that I would like to make about the voluntary standards, I certainly agree that voluntary standards do remove some element of choice. Just by way of an anecdote, I have a friend who was kicked off of, I think it was one of the Christian dating sites because she did not want to have children, for example. And that's terms of service that's kind of buried within there. It's not exactly clear. So all that I'm saying is there are certain edge providers on either side of the aisle that might have the hammer fall on them if you start having these sorts of restrictions on choice. And yet, on the other hand, voluntary standards have a sneaky way in many regulatory areas of becoming the de facto standard of care for some sort of legal action or for some sort of regulatory fine. So I guess just in general, caution on these sorts of issues because we've seen incredible growth of the internet since it was invented by Al Gore some decades ago. and there's
That was the internet highway. Yeah, that's right.
There's no reason to, now that we're having, there's no reason to start messing with something that's not necessarily broken.
Jeffrey Rosen.
I share Andrew's skepticism of voluntary or uniform standards. Facebook, Twitter, and Google are not the same thing. Facebook sees itself as a community. Google is both an information provider and in its YouTube role, kind of user-generated broadcaster. And Twitter is a free speech engine. So there's no reason they should all have the same free speech standards. I do think we've been talking about two things here, and I agree with Andrew that the net neutrality debate and the free speech debate are not the same. Net neutrality could, in theory, have free speech dimensions. There were objections when Comcast removed barbershop quartet videos in the King James Bible, but it turned out that it removed it not because of content objections, but because it was trying to favor, the allegation was not proved and strongly denied by Comcast, that it was trying to favor its own proprietarily owned file sharing service against the file sharing service of its competitor. So net neutrality is an economic issue on which Amazon and the other companies fall on different sides. it has free speech implications, but I don't think we should confuse them. And I also, there's strong free speech advocates like my friend Lawrence Lessig at Harvard, who are big net neutrality advocates, but don't mind price discrimination. They think that, in fact, allowing Comcast to charge Netflix more for its bandwidth, which takes up a lot of service space, will allow Comcast to charge consumers in general less for this lower lane service. Complicated issue, but I think different from the question of what free speech standards should the companies apply. I guess my last thought is that although these are troubling examples, there are good examples on the other side, and I just am struck by how seriously the companies, Facebook, Google, and Twitter in particular, take these content decisions. They're leaving up an awful lot of controversial hate speech in the face of tremendous worldwide political pressure to take it down. And I think the real trouble is not the individuals, but the standards themselves. The right way to improve them is the kind of work that you are so importantly doing here. I agree, just publicizing the examples and pressuring the standards to be more First Amendment friendly. And I hope ultimately, I think I'm an optimist here, because I think as the companies contemplate two choices, one, the European world where anyone whose dignity is affected or offended can demand a takedown, and the other, the inspiring American world, which is much more fractious and messy, but really allows free speech to flourish, they'll realize that the American version is in their interest. And in that sense, I hope they will impose a kind of American free speech imperialism on the world, not by judicial fiat, because I think the court should stay out of this, and I think that Google was quite wrong when threatened with a lawsuit on the idea that it was favoring its own search results over those of its competitors. Google's response was, everything we do is protected speech. Our algorithm is First Amendment protected, therefore it would be a violation of our First Amendment rights to make us be neutral in our algorithm. I think that was an adventurous position, to put it mildly, which would immunize Google from all regulation. Better, I think, to do what you're doing, keep up the political pressure, and convince the companies that in the end, they will flourish when information and speech are free.
Paul.
There's been a lot said today, and it's a little bit confusing because two major topics have been kind of commingled here. One is free speech by edge providers in a competitive market, and the other is the thought of throttling or not of content bits, whatever their source, by those in a non-competitive market. I agree that net neutrality is economic, but it's economic because there's a lack of competition for that last mile. And we don't want to be in a position where consumers are forced to abide by the economic choices made by their non-competitive broadband internet access provider. I reject the notion that Comcast or other operators have built out their networks in order to charge Netflix. That's not true. They've built out those networks in order to charge their end consumers, and I completely agree, Andrew, that they ought to be able to charge different rates for different bandwidth usages. I mean, if some kid's doing 24/7 gaming, sure, charge them more than grandma sending a few emails. I get that, that's fine. But they can't be able to do those to decide what grandma or the kid get to see based on their economic deals with entities with whom they don't have any privity. That really is the debate on net neutrality. As to the censorship aspects of things, I just think that your work shining a light on instances of this is important.
Thank you, Paul. Let's have a round of applause. We're going to open it up for questions. Let me just check the time. We're running a little bit short. We've got about 8 to 10 minutes, and we have our roving microphone out there that Jennifer has. Anyone with a question, raise your hand, and Joe Chotan.
I want to thank all the panelists, first of all. I wanted to hear perhaps what your thoughts were when it comes to violence. And we saw this in the past 2 to 3 weeks. We had beheading videos that, those even by Twitter were taken down. And where does that fall in the spectrum? You have the extreme killing, and then you have a Ray Rice video where violence is occurring there, and sort of where does that fall in the big mix?
And by the way, background, Supreme Court said no violent videos, when they're not going to carve out a special exception to the First Amendment based on violent videos, just by way of background. Anybody want to address that?
Sure.
Jeffrey.
You're absolutely right. There was that Crush video case, very troubling fetish videos. The Supreme Court said those are First Amendment protected. But how interesting that last week Facebook, Google, and Twitter made a different decision. Facebook, in the end, decided to post still shots from the beheading videos and snippets from the videos that did not glorify the violence, but not the entire thing. Google and Twitter made similar but differently nuanced decisions, as did the New York Times, which did show the actual pictures, but not in full videos. What's so interesting about this is it could have been justified within the terms of their terms of service, which prohibit certainly incitement to violence, but allow political speech. But the thing is that this was a hard call within the terms of service themselves, and there's no jurisprudence. That's why this is so fascinating for me as a lover of constitutional debate, that they're having to kind of create from the ground up a whole new case law, applying their community standards to these terribly tough cases. And like all judges, which is really what they are in these cases, they're making different decisions, but they're trying to balance different values. So, you know, a long way of saying I don't think it was a series of tough calls, and I don't think they made bad ones, but it just reminds us how much incredible power and discretion they have.
Not only a lot of power, but also we're in a frontier area of policy, like you said. Next question. To those who are still awake.
I have one other thing.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
As I understand it, Google, let's say in China, I mean, they just have a deal essentially in terms of censorship with the Chinese government. But how do you feel about that? How does that affect the corporate culture? You know, if they have that sort of understanding in one zone and a different one, let's say in Saudi Arabia, they come to peaceful terms, you know. How do you think that affects their culture when it comes to the United States? Or what's your thought about that?
In other words, should these companies be complicit with local national law? And Google, by the way, my recollection was they were complicit with China's laws on striking certain words from search terms, many of them religious in nature, but not all of them, some political. But then they took the position, the high road, and backed out of that. But I know some cell phone providers that work in Iran that will block access from Iran telephone calls to Western, telephone sites. So the question is that defensible? On a free market day, the pure free market says, if that's the market and that's what the government wants you to do, or should there be a higher standard? Should they, elevate their interaction with the local government on a higher standard and provide a moral pedagogy to say, this is not just a consumer issue. To those to whom much is given, much is expected in terms of the social and moral obligation for free speech. Andrew?
Yeah, I'd just like to say 2 points on that. One, just in contrast to what Professor Rosen said, I'm not sure that companies are incapable of managing multiple standards, and I think that example shows that Google at least sees profit incentive in going into China, even though it's difficult for them to manage. Google also sees a profit motive in remaining in Europe, even though they have these new privacy regulations. Google sees a profit motive in remaining in the United States, even though you see all the time those DMCA takedown notices at the bottom of your search results. So these are many of these are large corporations that are quite capable of handling multiple regimes. Universities, from my experience, also do the same thing. A campus in Abu Dhabi might have different speech restrictions as compared with the campus in the United States. So they're very capable, at least as a practical matter, of doing this. And so I would just caution using unmanageability of multiple standards as the reason to not have, the reason to allow one single speech regime. I would just caution on that. But I do think it creates some sort of bifurcation in their mind to some degree. Their first thought at the middle of the night when they get these phone calls is to say, what's the local law here? Their first thought is not to say, well, why are you calling me? Shut up and leave it online, for example. So there is some cultural thing there. And I think the second, perhaps, disagreement with Professor Rosen is that this does demonstrate, I think, that the policies they have on the books are not necessarily as important as their culture.
Could I respond very
Yes,
quickly to
Jeffrey,
these
go
two
ahead.
good points? I was not at all suggesting that the companies have a single standard across the world. They can't. They're not allowed to. The Yahoo decision prohibits that. Remember, Yahoo at the dawn of the age of the internet said, we don't have to obey French law prohibiting Holocaust denial material, information must be free. And a French judge said, oh really? I'm gonna fine you, I don't know, 50,000 euros a day unless you take down this Holocaust denial material, which is illegal in France, but legal in the US. And Yahoo said, you know what, okay, we'll do it. So that all of the companies are legally obligated to obey clear local laws, and when they're in China, they don't have the option of leaving out material that's obviously illegal in China, just as they have to remove stuff that's clearly illegal in Turkey or France. Google did make the decision, after having gone into China, that they ultimately were not comfortable obeying Chinese law that was so antithetical to their free speech values that they wanted to pull out, and I think that was a good decision. When I called for American free speech imperialism, kind of whimsically, I didn't mean a single standard for the whole world. I meant in the interstices of the law, in the gray areas, in cases where it's not clear whether a particular video is criticizing Ataturk, which is obviously illegal in Turkey and has to come down, or whether it's political protest where they have discretion to leave stuff up, then they should leave stuff up. But otherwise, for better or for worse, they've got to obey local laws for fear of really serious penalties.
Either obey local law or make the decision that, in fact, they're not going to seek those markets for corporate conscience reasons. And by the way, this is nothing new. Corporations have for quite a while adopted a conscience approach to everything from rainforest to child labor. And there's no reason why corporations shouldn't be making through their stockholders decisions about whether they do or do not want to partner with companies that are hostile to Western values in terms of free speech. So it's both an economic and a social conscience issue that I suppose we can say can be resolved at the stockholders meeting for those that have declared themselves to be public corporations. By the way, China, according to one source I just saw, has just, or is on the precipice of just filing the world's largest IPO for their online platform. We obviously don't, here in the United States, don't have a corner on technology, and we're going to see competition from other countries as well in terms of innovation. This dialogue is not just going to be a Washington, D.C. thing. This is going to be a global conversation. Last item, and if we still have a couple minutes, Melissa. I don't know how conversant all of us are, because it's a little bit unfair because I didn't prepare this question, but we all know that President Obama has indicated that ICANN, which is the International Private Constituent Board that really regulates domain names on the internet, has been technically under the supervision of the American government, but we've given ICANN board, which are private experts, free rein in terms of the decisions they make on the policies of ICANN. President Obama has indicated that we're basically to turn this over to ICANN, and ICANN is going to make their own decisions in terms of who is going to run ICANN, which is the closest thing we have to any aspect of global control of the internet. Do any of you see any risk or problems in some of the directions that the ICANN board has proposed? I mean, they're proposing, sort of a national, a mega board comprised of cooperating nations with a majority vote or a supermajority vote on those nations, and you're including Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other countries, which is a little troubling. Are any of you conversant with this and want to venture any comments about the aspect of international control of the internet?
Well, I'll only just say that my organization, the Heritage Foundation, has said that they think it's a bad idea. It's a voluntary cession of a right that the United States has had with no real clear benefit on the other side to turning it over to international governance. And as you alluded to, there are potential problems. When the United States is one of the more speech-free regimes, for lack of a better term, out there, handling over the ability to regulate things which often do go to content to regimes that may be less speech protective is potentially a troubling thing.
Okay. First of all, let's all thank our panelists.
thank you again on behalf of NRB. This has been the perfect kind of discussion we wanted to have, and we hope to keep the conversation going. And this brochure is in your packet, by the way. And I do think, you know, the consensus seems to be that actually just moral suasion, shining the light. We've heard those kinds of phrases, just talking about it in this kind of venue and other venues. Let's thank Craig for staying alert and his team doing the research, Jennifer as well, tracking these instances. If you know of instances you want to call to our attention, we're just trying to gather this material. We will keep looking at it and putting it together. And we're thrilled. Well, let's just stand and take a break, but don't go anywhere, or if you do, come right back, because you're about to hear some fascinating research from Heritage on some points of interest. Thanks again. Well, look, we've got lots of stuff. My wife is ready to come.
I'm gonna go to the restroom. I'll grab a biscuit.